One stretch of the front line in southern Ukraine has been shifting for weeks, while almost every headline about this war stays fixed on a single city hundreds of kilometers away. According to the Institute for the Study of War, that quieter shift is happening in Zaporizhia Oblast, even as attention stays locked on the fight for Pokrovsk. So what happens to a front line when almost nobody is watching it? By the end of this video, you'll understand what the open source evidence actually shows about that southern front, why analysts think it's connected to the more famous fight further north, and which parts of this story are confirmed versus which are still just claims. In a war this heavily documented, the gap between confirmed and claimed is often where the real story lives. Let's start with what this video is not. It's not a prediction of how the war ends, and it's not a judgment on who's winning. It's an attempt to walk through, carefully and with sources named, what independent analysts are actually seeing on a map and where the evidence runs out. The Institute for the Study of War, usually shortened to ISW, is a Washington-based think tank that has published a daily assessment of the war in Ukraine since the full-scale invasion began in 2022. Its assessments draw on geolocated combat footage, statements from the Ukrainian General Staff and Russian Ministry of Defense, Russian and Ukrainian military bloggers, satellite imagery, and independent reporting. ISW is upfront about its method. Claims backed by geolocated visual evidence get marked confirmed. Claims resting only on one side's statement get marked as exactly that, a claim, not a fact. I went through ISW's recent campaign assessments side by side, and one detail kept nagging me. The maps for the Zaporizhia sector kept shifting in small, steady increments week after week without ever producing a single dramatic headline. Compare that to Pokrovsk, where nearly every incremental change gets its own wire story. That contrast, quiet change in one place and loud, closely tracked change in another, is the actual subject of this video. Here's the first problem with telling this story honestly. Verifying gradual advances is genuinely harder than verifying one dramatic battle. A city under siege generates footage constantly, social media clips, drone strikes, statements from both governments, because everyone has an incentive to talk about it. A slow push across open farmland in a less watched sector generates far less footage, fewer geolocated clips, fewer statements from officials with limited attention to spend. Analysts work with a thinner evidence trail, which is why ISW flags so many Zaporizhia claims as reported rather than confirmed. The fix isn't guessing. It's waiting for corroboration, weighing multiple sourced claims against each other, and updating the map only once geolocated evidence catches up. So what does the reporting, cross-referenced between ISW's assessments and Kiev independent coverage, actually describe? A pattern. While most Russian offensive operations and most Ukrainian defensive resourcing concentrate around Pokrovsk, Russian forces have reportedly kept making incremental gains further south in Zaporizhia Oblast. Analysts cited in this reporting say that front has drawn less resourcing and less media scrutiny than Pokrovsk, and that the lack of attention may itself be part of why the advances there have faced less resistance. That's worth sitting with. This isn't a claim that one battlefield matters more than another in some abstract sense. It's narrower and more falsifiable. Attention and resources are finite. Both are concentrated on Pokrovsk, and a second front is reportedly moving partly because of that concentration. You can actually check that against a map over time, which is exactly what ISW's daily control of terrain assessments are built to do. Here's where it gets more complicated than one front loud, one quiet. Analysts don't treat these as two separate stories that happen to overlap. They see them as linked strategically. If a defending force has to choose where to put its best units, its artillery, its reserves, every unit sent to hold Pokrovsk is one not available to reinforce Zaporizhia. That's basic resource allocation under pressure, not a controversial idea. What's genuinely uncertain, and what ISW is careful to flag as analysis rather than fact, is whether Russian planners are deliberately using Pokrovsk to pull attention and reserves away from the south, or whether the Zaporizhia gains are simply a byproduct of wherever Ukrainian forces happen to be thinnest. Both explanations are plausible. Neither is confirmed. A responsible account of this war has to hold on to that distinction instead of picking whichever version makes a better headline. What surprised me most isn't that a second front exists. Wars almost always have more than one active sector. It's how far that second front can move in analyst assessments before it produces a single viral clip. Pokrovsk gets satellite tracked, geolocated, and debated block by block in near real time. Zaporizhia, per these assessments, can shift meaningfully over weeks and barely register outside specialist trackers and the daily ISW report. That's not because the Zaporizhia front is less real. It's because visibility in this war, like in most wars, follows wherever the cameras and the officials already are. So here's the harder question. If a front line can move for weeks with limited public attention, how would you, or any outside observer, actually know? The honest answer is you'd rely on the same layered, attributed, slow-to-update process ISW uses. Not a single tweet, not a single ministry statement, but a pattern of geolocated confirmations, cross-checked against multiple sources, updated in small increments, with unconfirmed claims kept clearly labeled as such. That's slower than social media. It's also far less likely to be wrong. There's a second problem worth naming. Both governments have an incentive to shape how this front gets described. Russian sources have an incentive to describe gains as larger and faster than the geolocated evidence supports to project momentum. Ukrainian sources have an incentive to describe the same sector as stable or contested to avoid signaling a weak point. ISW's method exists specifically to filter both incentives out, treating official statements from either government as claims to check, not facts to repeat. When analysts write reportedly, or according to Russian sources, unconfirmed, that phrasing isn't hedging for its own sake. It's the discipline that keeps an open source assessment usable. Here's the take that'll probably get some pushback. The coverage gap between Pokrovsk and Zaporizhia isn't really a failure of journalism, and it isn't really a failure of military planning either. It's closer to a structural feature of how any modern war gets covered. Newsrooms and general audiences can only sustain intense focus on one or two flashpoints at a time. That's not a moral failing, but it has a real cost. A sector can shift for weeks with comparatively little scrutiny simply because attention is scarce and already spent elsewhere. Analysts, not audiences, end up carrying the job of tracking the parts of the war nobody's watching. What strikes me most about this pattern is what it says about how modern wars get understood from the outside. We don't experience wars as one continuous battlefield. We experience them as whichever fragment gets the most coverage that week. The Zaporizhia-Pokrovsk pattern is a reminder that the front line and the headline are two different maps, and they don't always move together. Would you have noticed a sector like this shifting if you weren't looking at a daily assessment map built specifically to track it? Most people wouldn't, and that's not a knock on anyone watching this. It's just how attention works when a war runs for years instead of weeks. So where does this stand as of late July 2026? ESW's assessments describe continued, incremental Russian advances in parts of Zaporizhia Oblast, corroborated by geolocated footage for some specific gains and still listed as unconfirmed for others. The Kiev Independence reporting, cross-referenced with these assessments, frames the pattern the same way analysts do. A front that has drawn less resourcing and less scrutiny than Pokrovsk, moving in a way that's hard to headline but not hard to verify as long as you read past the first paragraph. Nothing in the available geolocated evidence supports claims of a rapid breakthrough in the sector. Nothing supports claims that the front is fully static either. The accurate description sits between those two extremes, steady, incremental, contested, and only partially confirmed at any given moment. That's exactly the kind of situation ISW's methodology exists to track responsibly. And here's the honest complication with no tidy resolution. There's no obvious fix for the attention gap this video describes. A defending force facing a major, heavily resourced offensive at one point on the map has limited capacity to reinforce a second, quieter one at the same time. That's not a communications problem. It's a resource problem. And resource problems don't get solved by better headlines. What can change is how carefully outside observers track the quieter front, so incremental shifts don't stay invisible just because they're incremental. Is it fair to say a front gets less attention because it's simply less dramatic on a given day? Or is that framing itself part of the problem, because less dramatic and less important quietly become the same thing in coverage decisions? Worth sitting with, whichever answer you land on. So back to where we started. The front line in Zaporizhia hasn't been standing still, according to independent, geolocated assessments. It's been moving in small increments, largely outside the spotlight fixed on Pokrovsk. Analysts describe the two fronts as strategically linked through the basic mechanics of limited resources and limited attention, even while the specific intent behind that link remains, honestly, unconfirmed. If you want to track this yourself rather than take any single video's word for it, ISW publishes its control of terrain maps and written assessments daily, free, with every claim sourced. That's the habit worth building if this kind of story interests you. Read the daily assessment over a few weeks, and it'll tell you a more complete version of this story than any single video could.